Welcome to this third webinar in the Infinite Fire series of the Bibliotheca Philosophica Hermetica, organized in collaboration with the Chair for History of Hermetic Philosophy and Related Currents at the University of Amsterdam. I have been giving two webinars previously, one about Platonic Orientalism, the revival of Platonic Orientalism in the Renaissance, and another one about what I call the real Hermetic tradition. And these were two topics that were very closely interconnected. One thing that connected them, among other things, was that both of them are very much part of a Roman Catholic context. And it's important to emphasize right away that when we talk about esoteric currents in Western culture, Western esotericism, esoteric traditions, then this is not a tradition that is separate from the main confessions like Catholicism or Protestantism, but they take very different shapes according to the confessional backgrounds where they develop. Now we will see this today in this third webinar about Jakob Böhme and his Christian theosophical system, because we will be moving from a Roman Catholic context to a Protestant context. Now the previous two webinars, Platonic Orientalism, the Hermetic tradition, in both cases we were dealing with a situation where an enormous emphasis in this Catholic context was put on tradition. The notion of tradition was absolutely central. The idea was here again and again that in order to find the truth, in order to find the supreme sources of wisdom, you have to go back far into the past through the origins of wisdom in remote times. And this wisdom had been passed on from ancient times through a whole series of sages, etc., a whole tradition of many centuries that ended up in Christianity and finally ended up in one's own time. So this notion of tradition, going back in the past and learning from the venerable sages of antiquity, that was central. Now this emphasis on tradition, which was so important in the Catholic context, could not actually be convincing for Protestants. And this is important to realize, because the very authority of tradition had been called seriously into question by the events of the Reformation. Because the Reformation made the point that the whole church, since the early apostolic community, had been corrupted seriously. And many Protestant polemicists were making the point that actually, since the papacy was instituted, the church had been deflected entirely away from the true Christian message, had been corrupted, and actually the Pope was the Antichrist. And the Antichrist was sitting on the throne of Christ himself, of St. Peter. So the church had been turned from a vehicle for the true Christian message into a vehicle for the demonic infiltrations of the Antichrist. So this meant that the whole institution of Christianity, of Roman Catholicism, could no longer be trusted. The very authority of a tradition, of the church tradition, was radically undermined by the Protestants. How could one trust the representatives of these traditions? The priests, bishops, popes, how could one trust them? That was, well, distrust in tradition, in the authority of tradition, was no longer possible for Protestants in the way it had been for Catholics. And that left, of course, the question for Protestant Christians, well, where then to turn in the search for answers for the truth? Well, there was only one possible answer for Protestants, and that was ask God himself. Don't ask his representatives, don't ask human traditions, don't ask priests and other authorities, go directly to God himself. Well, how do you do that? Well, we will see that three possible ways of doing that were all very important for the great Protestant visionary and Christian theosopher Jakob Böhme, who is the topic of this webinar. One possibility of talking directly with God, or getting directly in contact with God, was reading the Bible. That was the most obvious answer for Protestants. Read directly the Word of God. And well, the Bible was of course seen as from cover to cover as one integral whole, which had been revealed by God himself, which was God's Word. So you had to read it directly. It used to be the case in the Roman Catholic context that believers seldom read the Bible directly. The interpretation of the Bible was mediated by priests, by the intermediaries instituted by the church. Protestantism said no, the normal believers have to read the Bible directly in order to have direct access to God's word. This means, of course, that, for instance, Lutheran translated the Bible into German so that normal believers could read it. So that was one way of getting answers directly from God himself, reading the Bible. A second way of getting in touch with the true message of God was by way of individual experience, individual religious experience. And in many cases this meant experience mediated through prayer, an intense practice of prayer. In the Protestant context, man stands directly over against God. There are no intermediaries. In principle, the creature, who is a sinful creature in a Protestant context, stands directly over against the Creator, who has created everything. So there is this awful, frightening encounter between the maker of heaven and earth and everything and a very tiny human creature. And they are face to face. There's nobody in between who can mediate between them. This is, of course, an existential situation that can be frightening and awe-inspiring and so on. And you can imagine what kind of an emotional situation it can be to feel that you're confronted directly with God in your prayer practice. Now, this kind of situation led sometimes to intense religious experiences of people who felt that they actually had been answered in their prayers by God and had been illuminated and had received answers not only directly from the Bible but through a personal religious experience. Thirdly, and then I'm thinking more of the later 16th century and especially the 17th century, there was a third way of finding out about what God really meant. And that was by reading the book of nature. This is a development that is particularly important in the context of what we call Christian forms of esotericism, or esoteric forms of Christianity, Christian theosophical currents and so on. The emphasis on the book of nature next to the book of the Bible was inspired, among other things, by alchemical traditions and especially by the great medical authority and kind of alchemist and religious thinker Paracelsus in the 16th century. The idea here was that God had, in fact, you might say, written two books. On the one hand there was the Bible, on the other hand there was the book of nature, and these two complemented one another, so to speak. God had revealed many of his messages through a kind of mysterious script that was inscribed in the very in nature itself, and the term that was often used was signatures, mysterious writings, so to speak, that were present in nature. So there are three ways for Protestants to get directly in contact with God: through the Bible, through personal religious experience, and through studying the book of nature. Now, this combination of trying to find answers and find knowledge in this way led to all kinds of Protestant, more or less heterodox movements. There are all kinds of traditions of what is known as Christian spiritualism, which took many shapes. There is the more specific tradition known as Christian theosophy, and that is what we will be focusing on today. There are also, eventually, there was the whole movement of that is known as pietism, which is a difficult concept that takes many shapes. And there are many of the ideas that I was just referring to, you find also in the pietist movement, but that's a topic for another lecture. My focus today will be on Christian theosophy, and this Christian theosophy emerged by the end of the 16th century and really had its most splendid representative in the work of Jakob Böhme, the cobbler from Görlitz, who will be the main topic of my talk today. Jakob Böhme lived from 1575 to 1624, so he became 49 years old. He was born in Görlitz, a town which is presently on the border of Germany and Poland. And if you ever have a chance on vacation or anything to visit Görlitz, It's highly recommended. It's one of the towns in Germany that have not been destroyed in the Second World War, fortunately. And it has still this wonderful atmosphere of this old town. You can still imagine Jakob Böhme walking around there in Görlitz. There is a lot there also to be found. There's a museum with things related to Jakob Böhme. You can visit the cemetery where he's buried and so on. Görlitz is very proud, quite rightly, of their great son Jakob Böhme. Jakob Böhme was born in a prosperous Lutheran peasant family, and he took the trade of a shoemaker. He became a master shoemaker in Görlitz in 1599, and he married the daughter of once again a prosperous butcher. So he was quite well-to-do as a shoemaker. They had 4 children, and all of this looked like a very normal career for a person in his time and place. However, Jakob Böhme was subject to fits of melancholy and depression. He was deeply concerned about the question of why is there so much evil and so much suffering in the world. He was reading the Bible, he was a Lutheran, he was reading the Bible intensely, and he was trying to find answers to that question. Why all this suffering? Why all these terrible things that are happening in our world? And of course you have to realize that he was living in a time where the confessional battles were raging in Germany. And the confessional battles after, all of them in the wake of the Reformation. A lot of bloodshed, a lot of violence, a lot of suffering. And Böhme saw not only suffering in the human world, but also in nature. He was wandering around, and there you have the book of nature. He was wandering around in the fields, in the forests, and he said everywhere animals are eating each other, everything is violence against each other. Where does all this violence and suffering come from? How is this to be reconciled with the belief that we as Christians are supposed to have, that God is a good God, a God of love? Why does a God of love create a world that is so full of suffering? Well, these questions brought him into deep, melancholic, depressed states, and he was struggling with these questions, and he couldn't find an answer. He describes this in his first book, a kind of the famous masterwork. His first book, Aurora, which means dawn, morning rising. Morning sun rising, Morgenröte im Aufgang, which was published in 1612. Well, he describes here how this happened. He said, and I'm quoting here from the Aurora, "I finally sank into a deep state of melancholy and sadness, as I looked at the great depth of this world, and the sun and the stars, as well as the clouds and rain and snow, and in my spirit beheld this entire worldly creation, in which I then found evil and good in all things, love and wrath, in the unreasoning creatures, in wood, stones, earth and the elements, as well as in human beings and animals. And then I considered the little spark of man, what worth he might possibly have for God as compared to these great works of heaven and earth. But I found that there was evil and good in all things, in the elements as well as in the creatures, and that in this world the godless were faring as well as the pious, and barbarians possessed the best lands, and that happiness favoured them more than the pious. About all this I was quite melancholic and deeply saddened, and of all the books, although I knew them well, none could give me comfort, and the devil often inspired hedonist thoughts in me, about which I will be silent here." So that is his description of his struggle about clarification. So you have to imagine Jakob Böhme here, this cobbler working, making shoes, repairing shoes, etc., and at the same time thinking about this continuously, and reading the Bible, trying to find answers, and engaged no doubt in intense prayers, asking God for illumination, for light, for enlightenment. He literally compares himself with his namesake Jacob from the Bible, from the Old Testament, who was fighting with God and who was finally blessed by the angel with whom he was fighting. He compares himself with Jacob Böhme and Jacob from the Bible. Finally, all this struggle, all this worrying, all this sadness resulted in an answer, in an ecstatic vision that overcame him in 1600, when he was 25 years old. This has been described by his biographer Abraham von Frankenberg, and the story goes, we do not know how true this is, but the beautiful story is that one day Jakob Böhme entered his room in the morning. There was a tin vessel or a pewter vessel standing on the table, dark metal, and there was a beam of light coming from the window that was reflected in that vessel, and somehow this triggered what we might now call a kind of an altered state of consciousness, a strange trance-like state, an ecstatic state in which everything was transformed. Jakob Böhme for hours and hours seems to have stayed in this state, and he didn't know what was happening to him, but this was the great experience of illumination that lies at the foundation actually of his later work. And let me quote his own description of this experience here. So this is a second quotation, again from the Aurora. So I quote, "But then, when in such sadness my spirit, of which I hardly understood what it was, earnestly rose up against God, as if with a great storm, and all my heart and soul, all my other thoughts and my will decided to struggle with the love and mercy of God, and not to give up until he would bless me." That's a reference to Jacob. That is to say, until he would enlighten me with his Holy Spirit, so that I might understand his intentions and be released from my sadness, then the Spirit broke through. But as I, in my determination, stormed hard against God and against all the gates of hell, as if I had even more power and was willing to give my life for it, something of which I could not have been capable without the help of God's Spirit, after several hard attempts, finally my spirit has broken through the gates of hell and all the way into the innermost birth of the Godhead, and was received there with love, the way a groom receives his dear bride. But this triumph in the spirit I cannot express by the written or spoken word. Indeed, it cannot be compared with anything, but with the birth of life in the midst of death, and with the resurrection of the dead. In this light my spirit has right away seen through everything, and in all creatures, even in herbs and grass, it has seen God, who he is, how he is, and what his will is. And right away in this light my will has grown with a great desire to describe the essence of God. So you see, this very imposing experience that overcame him, this experience of illumination, stimulated him and inspired him to start writing and try to describe the essence of God himself. The traditional story has it that Böhme left his house, he wandered through nature, and like he says in this passage, everything in a way had become transparent. He was seeing God through everything, in plants and animals and weeds and grass and so on. First he seems to have thought that this was a temptation of the devil, but eventually he concluded that this must actually be God speaking to him through this experience and through the experience of nature. So there you have it, the emphasis on nature, the book of nature, nature as a source of revelation in an imposing religious experience, very much inspired by his intense Bible reading. Now let me read you one more passage from the Aurora, which describes this vision that he had and its implications. This is a further quotation. "Now it is from this light," Böhme writes, "that I have my knowledge," this light of this illuminating experience, "that I have my knowledge, as well as my will and desire, and I will write down this knowledge as well as I can, and let God do as he wishes, even if I might anger the world, the devil, and all the gates of hell, and I will see what it is that God wants with this." By the way, here you see this very typical notion of Christian theosophy, of what is in German known as Gelassenheit, an attitude of passivity, of giving oneself over entirely to God's will. This is very prominent in Böhme. I continue. "For I am much too weak to understand his intentions, even though the Spirit throws light upon many things that still lie in the future. Still, as far as the outer person is concerned, I am much too weak to understand them." And what you then get is a passage in which Böhme writes about the wrath of God. And that's an absolutely central concept, we will see. We will come back to it later, the wrath of God. He writes the following: "I have not written this to praise myself, but to comfort the reader, in case he might wish to wander with me on my narrow road. that he may not despair too soon when he meets and beholds the gates of the hells and the wrath of God. When we, having taken this narrow road of the fleshly birth together, finally arrive at the green meadow, to where the wrath of God does not extend, then we will be glad over the hardship that we have experienced, though we may be considered fools by the world and have allowed the devil to overflow us in power of the wrath of God. It does not matter, for in this new life we will shine more brightly than if we had carried the king's crown in this life, for it is only a short time to there, and not even worth being called time. So here's this vision of an paradisical state, of a state of salvation that is possible if we do not give in to the temptations of the devil and to being afraid of the wrath of God, and when we actually walk with Böhme and find the way to salvation that he wants to expose in his books. Böhme had a second ecstatic vision or illumination in 1610, and from 1600 to 1612, so 12 years long, he has been working on this first masterwork, the Aurora Breaking Dawn, Morgenröte im Aufgang. This book was first circulated in manuscript. It was read a lot and it created immediately a lot of discussion and controversy among its readers. There were defenders, people who find it very inspiring, and there were people who criticized this as heresy. At one point, Gregor Richter, the Lutheran chief pastor of Görlitz, reprimanded Jakob Böhme severely and forbade him to continue writing about his theosophical ideas. Gregor Richter has remained the nemesis of Jakob Böhme, the great enemy of Jakob Böhme throughout his life. He saw him as a heretic and as a heterodox thinker who was deluding the people into a false religion. For a couple of years, Böhme seems to have listened, and he stopped writing and publishing until 1618, the year in which the 30 Years' War in Germany began. And in this year, he also started writing again, and he never stopped writing ever since. I have most of his writings here, and I will just mention some of the most important titles. There is his description of the 3 principles of divine being. Well, you see, it's a big book. The 3 principles of divine being. There is a book on the threefold life of man. I have several editions here. Often these books are beautifully illustrated, as you see here. We will come to this picture in a minute, and you see many other books with these beautiful Baroque pictures in the book. There is a book, 40 Questions about the Soul, which I have here. There is the book on how Jesus Christ became man, on the incarnation. There is a book on 6 theosophical points of 1620. A book, The Signature of All Things, and signature is this reference to the writing, the handwriting of God, so to speak, in nature. A very large book, the Mysterium Magnum of 1623, one of his main works. A book, The Way to Christ of 1624, which I have here. And throughout 1618 to his death in 1624, Böhme has kept writing letters, and these are the theosophical letters that are also, of course, published. In the year of Böhme's death, in 1624, he wrote a speech of defense against his enemy Gregor Richter. But in the same year, first Richter himself died, and very soon after, Jakob Böhme died as well. So the 2 enemies did not survive each other very long. Böhme was at that time very controversial, much discussed throughout Germany. He was seen as a major writer who evoked an enormous amount of controversy. After his burial, his grave was disturbed by a mob. And nowadays, when you come to Görlitz, and if you go to the beautiful graveyard that you have there, you will find Jakob Böhme's grave. It's really beautiful. I've seen it, with a big tombstone that was made by his admirers later, and which shows the basic principles on the tombstone of his theosophical system. A picture somewhat similar maybe to what we see here and what I will be talking about in a minute. So that was the life of Jakob Böhme, a life full of controversy, of one of the greatest visionaries in the Christian theosophical tradition. Okay, What then is the worldview of Jakob Böhme? What are the answers that he gave to his basic questions of the origin of evil, the origin of suffering in the world? How did he find a solution to those questions? Well, he developed a large theosophical system about the wisdom of God, theosophy. And it is not so easy to summarize his ideas, because Böhme is an unsystematic writer. It is often not easy to follow him. He writes a strange, quite creative, sometimes poetic German language, but it's not exactly systematic. Also, he's not a philosopher, and he's not a dogmatic theologian either in any way. He's a symbolic, visionary, mythical author. He thinks in images, and he tries to convey images, as we will see. So if you look for rational philosophical consistency, you'll be disappointed. Look for a visionary worldview. Also, he is continuously, you see him struggling with language in order to convey something that ultimately transcends words. Language is not sufficient to express the visions and the impressions that he had in his visions. So there you see him trying to find all kinds of different ways to express something that is very difficult to express. And finally, there's also the problem that his worldview changes all the time over the course of his life. In his different books, he keeps developing his ideas, using new metaphors, new ideas, contradicting earlier statements, etc. So all of this makes it very difficult to summarize Jakob Böhme's worldview. I will nevertheless try to do this, but this will be, of course, a somewhat streamlined, somewhat simplified version, and there are many variations on most of the things that I'm going to say. But this, what I'm going to say, will be hopefully give a picture of the main structure of Böhme's thought. Well, Böhme's cosmology, or his theosophical system, is all about the birth of God and the regeneration of man. These are the basic things it's all about. And when you talk about the birth of God, then you see immediately that we're dealing with a heterodox system here. We are not dealing with a system here where God is eternal and God has created the world. No, Böhme describes that God himself has not been eternal. He has emerged. He has been born out of something else before him. So that's immediately problematic from orthodox point of view. Böhme's worldview begins with the concept of what he calls the Ungrund, the unground. And the Ungrund is an original idea of Böhme himself. He says that there is a reality even before God himself. And this reality, the Ungrund, the unground, is a completely mysterious reality, which is so completely mysterious human beings are not able to say anything about it at all, and we will never be able to say anything about it. It's completely beyond our grasp, our understanding. All that we can talk about is how God himself manifests himself, but the reality that God comes from is forever beyond our grasp. That's the Ungrund, the mysterious, dark origin of all things. Now, out of this Ungrund, God himself is born. And this is a complicated process that is described by Böhme. And a point that is very important to emphasize is that in Böhme, God is born as a body. And this is another point where he clashes with many orthodox views, because we're used to thinking in Christian traditions that after death human beings they continue as spiritual beings. We leave the body behind, and the soul continues in a purely non-material reality. So there is of course a lot of distrust and a lot of negative feelings in Christian tradition about the body, because the body is the thing that draws us down to sin and to sexual desire and to all kinds of lower pursuits. Well, interesting with Böhme is that he is very positive about the body. He is not negative about it. The body is a good thing, and when he describes the birth of God as a spiritual body out of the Ungrund, that this is a positive process. As a sideline, I might say that it's almost funny, and it's certainly very interesting to note that in Böhme's worldview, angels and human beings after death have bodies, subtle bodies, but bodies. The only entities that don't have a body are demons. Demons are punished by God by the fact that they don't have a body. And this runs, again, contrary to the normal assumptions of a lot of Christians who think that the body has to be left behind. For Böhme, the body must not be left behind, but it must be transformed. It must be transmuted into a higher state. We will come back to that. So, God is being born out of the Ungrund as a body. And this body is also described by Jakob Böhme as die ewige Natur, eternal nature. Eternal nature. And when Böhme writes about God, the body of God as eternal nature, he very often uses this very sensual language, in the sense that all the human senses, all the senses are involved. There's a quotation that shows this very nicely. Somewhere Böhme writes that God is almighty, all-wise, all-knowing. Well, all of these are quite traditional attributes. But God is also all-seeing, all-hearing, all-smelling, all-feeling and all-tasting. So God doesn't just see everything, he tastes everything, he smells everything. All the senses are involved. So this means that Böhme is not, as people often think, an idealist. He is a counter-idealist. He doesn't believe in a purely spiritual reality distinct from the body. No, the body itself must be transmuted into a spiritual state. That's a very important point. Now, we come then to this image, this beautiful image from the Law edition, William Law edition of the works of Jakob Böhme. And most of what I'm going to say in the rest of this webinar will be referring to this picture, because in this picture you basically see all the elements of Jakob Böhme's worldview. Let me point out first here that you have the most important things here are these three circles. On the right hand for you, you see a dark circle, and this is what Böhme calls the first principle. The first principle. This is the first principle of all existence, and it's a dark reality. It is the reality of God's wrath, of God the Father. It is dark, it is frightening, we'll see why, and it is associated with the Old Testament. This is the dark, everything starts in darkness for Böhme. Then there is the second principle, which you see here. And the second principle is associated with the counterpart. Not with wrath, but with love. Not with God the Father, but with God the Son. In the traditional Christian terms, of course. Not with darkness, but with light. Not with the Old Testament, but with the New Testament. These are the two basic principles. Now, so there's this basic duality between the dark and the light principle. And these are the first two principles, as he calls them. And then there's the third principle, which you find here. And if you look at it closely, you will see that you see the zodiac, and you see the stars, and you see basically this is the world, this is our world that we are living in. This is the cosmos. This is the cosmos that we find ourselves in. And this is not eternal nature, but it is temporal nature, the world in time and space. That's the third principle. So all of us are living in the third principle, and right now we are filming here in the third principle because that is what we're part of. That's according to Böhme how these are the basic elements. Now, Böhme describes how God is being born out of the Ungrund, and this is a gradual process. For the first to the second principle first, and you can best understand this process in terms of alchemy. In alchemical thinking, there is the process of transmutation. Everything starts with the darkness of the prima materia, the dark prime matter of reality, and the prime matter is being transmuted through complicated stages of development until finally, hopefully, we'll reach the ultima materia, the final matter, which is a light, which is a bright, light, golden, beautiful, harmonious substance. So you have from darkness, you go to light in the alchemical process. That's the very general nature of alchemy. From darkness to light, from prime matter to ultimate matter. Now this kind of thinking, Böhme was certainly influenced by alchemical and Paracelsian thought. This kind of thinking is essential to understand how God is born from the Ungrund. So basically, the birth of God himself is seen as a kind of an alchemical process taking place on the largest possible metaphysical level. Now alchemy is about matter. It's about very concrete physical substances. It is very much involved not just with theoretical concepts, but with very concrete things that can be tasted and touched and so on. And this is also, this very concrete materiality is also what you find in Jakob Böhme's description of how God is born. Because the birth of God takes place in 7 stages. Now we've seen there are the first and the second principle. I'm not sure whether you can see it from a distance, but if you look very closely at this circle here, at the first principle, then you see that there are 3 smaller circles inside it. 1, 2, 3. These are the first 3 qualities, as Böhme describes it. So, in the first principle, 3 qualities. Then here you see a lighting flash. That is the 4th quality. And this 4th quality is on the margin between the dark circle and the light circle of the second principle. In this second principle, finally, there are once again 3 qualities. These are the 5th, the 6th and the 7th quality. So you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 qualities. And these qualities can be seen as the 7 stages, so to speak, that the process of the birth of God goes through. Now, the way that Böhme describes these qualities are, once again, is very sensual. Sensual in the sense that that it's not theoretical, not in any way idealistic, but it's linked in his case to sensations of taste. He's trying to describe how does a quality feel. How does it feel to be in the first quality of the birth of God? How does it feel? Well, the first quality he calls die herbe Qualität. Now, herb in German means something like sour, acid, rough. So these are sensations of touch and of taste. And what he talks about is a sensation of contraction, of infinite contraction, moving inward. A movement of the desire of God, the desire to be born, the desire that has been woken up in the Ungrund. And this desire at first turns inward in the first quality. And this movement has no limit, so it keeps going inward. And the final result of this is petrification. Everything turns to stone, so to speak. So this first is quality of taste, of turning inward, of contraction. And this is a movement that he tries to convey also by all kinds of references, for instance, to the planet of Saturn. Of course, in this stage of the birth of God, Saturn as a planet doesn't exist yet, but as a kind of reality, somehow it exists for Jakob Böhme, and he says this first quality is ruled by Saturn, the cold, sharp and severe, bitter ruler, has dominion over the chamber of death and dries up all the powers from which corporeality emerges. This is the kind of language that he uses. So, the herbe Qualität of contraction, it's the first quality. That's where everything starts. Now, if it would stay with this, nothing would ever happen, because you would only have had this movement of contraction. What's necessary is a counter reaction, and that is the second quality. This movement of contraction evokes a reaction, and he describes it as die bittere Qualität, the bitter quality, and he uses words like gall, or poison, or sting, or an arrow, something like that, something sharp. So there comes a counter reaction against the infinite movement of contraction, a movement of expansion, of coming out, of breaking out. An expansive movement of escape. The movement of the first quality leads to petrification, to turning to stone. The second quality is a movement of breaking out from the prison of complete petrification and expand, by expanding out of it. So, these are 2 forces, so to speak, an inward and an outward movement, and they're equally strong, these 2 first qualities. So what you get is, and then we move to the third quality. In the third quality, we have the situation of 2 contrary forces, so to speak, in a kind of mortal combat with one another. They're equally strong. It's almost like the irresistible force meeting the immovable object. Well, a force that's irresistible cannot be resisted, but an immovable object cannot be moved. They're both equally strong, so there's a no escape situation of two forces that keep each other in the balance. The result, Böhme says, is a kind of a no escape situation, described in very frightening terms by him as an insanely whirling wheel, an Angstkammer, a chamber of fear, a literal prefiguration of hell, a kind of dark situation of contrary forces fighting with each other with no escape. This is written the prefiguration of hell. And for Jakob Böhme, this third quality is analogous to the situation of human beings who are walking in darkness and looking in vain for God. There is no escape. They're in a dark world and they cannot come out of it. So, this is how the birth of God starts, in a very dark, very frightening situation of wrath and darkness and suffering and contrary powers and no escape. That's the first quality. That's the first principle, consisting of three qualities. Now, how do we ever get out of this situation? How can God complete his process of rebirth and not remaining stuck in this negative situation? Well, this happens in the fourth quality, which is in the center, and which Böhme refers to as der Blitz, the flash. And the way he describes what happens is by using the analogy of fire. In the world in this hellish world of the first principle, this is ruled by the fire of God's wrath. The wrath of God as a fire, as a destructive fire, a dark fire that is cold, Böhme says, cold like the fire of fever. A very dark, destructive fire. However, fire can have negative, destructive implications, but it can have positive ones as well. This fire at one point reveals itself as a stroke of lightning, the flash. And this means that God's destructive power turns, the balance tips, so to speak, and it turns into a beneficent fire, a fire of love and life that gives warmth and light. So all the negative implications of fire are turned into positive ones, and the blitz, the fire, the flash of light, the light of the wrath of God turns out to be also to exist in the form of a light of love. It can transform itself into a light of love and warmth and life and so on. Now, this is where in this flash everything changes. This is where the balance tips from darkness to light. And then from there on, once this has happened, once the light, the beautiful, beneficent, life-giving light of warmth and love and so on, once it has revealed itself out of the darkness, it, so to speak, spreads and conquers everything. In the fifth quality, so that's one of the three circles here that are part of the second principle. In the fifth quality, it's described by Jakob Böhme as a world of love, light, joy. And what happens is that the love of God that has become manifest in the flesh, in the fourth quality, the love of God tempers and reconciles the wrath of God. The wrath of God that dominated the first principle is rendered harmless by the love of light, by the love of the light of the sun. The wrath of God isn't demolished, it isn't destroyed. It's still there, but it becomes latent. It's no longer visible. It recedes into the background. The sixth quality is described by Böhme more as in terms of sound. He describes it as sound, indeed, as tone, as the word. It is associated with hearing. It's associated with something like the harmony of the spheres. So he's talking about a harmonious world, which he describes more in terms of sounds than in terms of visual things. What emerges is a heavenly world of light and harmony. The wrath, the fear of the first principle are once again not destroyed, but they are rendered harmless in this beautiful harmonious world that emerges in the sixth quality. Hell has literally turned into heaven. And finally then we move to the seventh quality, which completes the whole cycle. This is the final completion of the process of the birth of God. And what we reach is a perfect corpus, a perfect body. this seventh quality is described by Jakob Böhme in terms of divine plenitude, a pleroma, a fullness of God, of love and harmony and light, a unification of all the seven qualities. This is you should think about this a bit in holographic terms, that all the seven qualities are united, are once again present in the seventh quality, and you could think of this going on infinitely, because in the seventh quality there are once again all the seven qualities present. In the seventh of them, all the seven are once again present, and so on and so forth. So finally, the dark matter of the beginning, the dark material, the dark reality of the beginning, the wrath of God, has turned into a light world of love and harmony and beauty in the second principle. So, the birth of God has been completed. What we have now is a beautiful, harmonious world of light, eternal nature, a world of harmony and bliss and love and light and all kinds of good qualities that you could think of. So you would think all is well that ends well, but it doesn't end there. It continues. This pleroma, traditional term, this light world, the body of God, is inhabited, Böhme writes, by countless entities, by beings of light who have been born and belong to this world light. So it's a kind of a community of light beings. And the highest of these beings is Lucifer. Now Lucifer, of course, means light, light bringer, light maker. Lucifer is the highest of the beings of light, of angelic entities that make up the body of God. And what happens is that Lucifer wants to be reborn as well. God has been born from an arduous process and reached this final blissful state. Lucifer has been born in light. He has never seen anything else. He hasn't been born from darkness into light. He has been born as light. He is light, and that's all he is. But he wants to go through a process. He wants to go higher. He wants to be born or reborn himself. Now the tragedy is that he achieved this. He achieves doing this, but the only way that he can go, since he is already perfect, since he is already perfect light, he can only go downwards. He can only be reborn as darkness out of light. And this is essential for understanding Böhme. Böhme's notion is that all good things are born as light out of darkness. That is the natural process, that is how things should go. And what happens here is the satanic inversion of that process. Darkness born out of light. So you have to imagine this great light world of bliss and harmony, and you might visually imagine this as you see this light world, and somewhere in the middle there's a tiny ink blot that appears, a tiny patch of darkness, which starts to spread and which starts to infect the whole light world. And the whole light world gradually gets disintegrated by this fall of Lucifer. Because the attempt of Lucifer to be reborn actually causes the eternal world, the eternal nature, God's body, to fall and to disintegrate. This is the tragical phenomenon that takes place. Now, out of this movement of disintegration, of the fall of Lucifer, emerges the third principle, and that is our world. So that's what you see here. So you see here that you see flows, emanations, so to speak, out of the two principles, finally flowing into our world. So our world is the result of the fall. It's a fallen world. Our world is the place also where the fall of Lucifer and the fall of God's body can possibly be repaired and be. So this is the place of reintegration. There has been a disintegration taking place, and we are living in this world, and our task is to find a way of reintegration, finding the way back to the lost harmony of the body of God. What happens because of the fall of Lucifer? A whole range of things happens. The first principle had been rendered harmless, invisible, latent in the completely fully integrated body of God. But now, because of the fall of Lucifer, it becomes separate again. It manifests itself as a dark counterworld against the light. It starts fighting with the light, and it turns literally into hell. The first principle, in its original form, the original wrath of God, this was not an evil world. It was the world of God's wrath. It was the world of the Old Testament, of the God of the Old Testament, who is dark and frightening, but not evil. Not evil. It is necessary in God's worldview to have a duality of light and darkness which hold each other in the balance. It's not the case that for him the Christian revelation abolishes the revelation of the Old Testament, or that the God of love, Jesus Christ, takes the place of the God of wrath, the Father of the Old Testament. No, the both are harmonized in one body. Both you need for a complete body of light, you need darkness and light. They have to hold each other in the balance. What happens because of the fall of Lucifer is that the two principles are no longer harmonized, but are separated from another and start to fight independently against each other. That is what happens, and that is what happens in our world. In our world is the stage, so to speak, in which the unleashed wrath of God is an independent force, is fighting against the power of love and light. That is our world. Now, the first principle turns into hell, and Lucifer is reborn indeed, but he is reborn as Satan, the prince of darkness, who is ruling in this dark world of hell. The second principle, the light world, is disintegrated, it is weakened, so to speak. But light cannot be destroyed once it's there. So it remains in existence, but it is weakened, it is disintegrated, it is apart now from its dark counterpart. So we have a situation of two very insufficient, very incomplete, very unsatisfactory manifestations of light and darkness, which are separate and independent from one another. Now, our world is, like I said, is the stage where light and darkness are fighting with one another, and at the same time this is the place where the redemption, where the reintegration can take place. Now, there's a lot of other things that could be said about the whole process that Böhme describes. For instance, there's not only the fall of Lucifer, there's also the fall of Adam and Eve, and he has a lot to say about this. I will not bring in all the complications about this, but I just mention the fact that there's a lot that could be said. The process of Böhme's theosophy is much more complicated than I can explain here. But this is the general context. Now, we find ourselves here in this world in an existential situation as human beings. We have to look at ourselves, according to Böhme, as a microcosm who reflects all the dynamics of the macrocosm. Everything that has taken place on the highest level, the birth of God, can also take place in the all small world of our own body and our own being. The same process of movement from darkness to light can take place in us. It can also be the other way around. We can also fall in the same way that Lucifer has fallen. So this is the existential situation. We are faced with a choice between light and darkness, and we have to choose sides in the battle that is going on between the unleashed wrath of God and the love of God and the light of God. So we are born here in this fallen world of darkness, just in the same way as God was born out of this dark, mysterious Ungrund and moved towards the light. In the same way, we are born in a world of darkness, and we are born there as sinful, very incomplete, very insufficient human beings, weak human beings who find ourselves initially in a state of darkness and suffering and a lot of negative things. That is where we start. Now, if God has been able to be born from darkness to light, so should we be able to do it, says Böhme. And it is possible for us to achieve the inner birth of Christ in our own heart. So the notion of Jesus being born inside yourself, which you now find also in all kinds of evangelical Christian circles and so on, you also find a form of that in Jakob Böhme. But he says that the light of God can be born in our own heart exactly in the same way that the flash of light took place, you might say, in the heart of God himself, when he was being born from darkness to light. That's what we should do. We should strive towards such an illumination and the birth of God in ourselves. By achieving such rebirth, we contribute to the reintegration not only of ourselves. We are not just looking for salvation for ourselves, but we are contributing to the reintegration of God himself, because God has fallen, eternal nature has fallen, and when all human beings will be reborn, then the fallen world will be reintegrated and the body of God will be unified again and reintegrated into the original harmony where it started. So, in other words, God, according to Böhme, needs human beings to overcome the effects of the fall. We are not doing it only for ourselves, we are doing it for the greater whole. We are doing it to save nature and to save God himself. This is the core message, I would say, that Böhme tries to convey in all his writings, and endless variations. It's much more complicated, but this is the essential message. So in closing, let me get back once more to this beautiful picture from the Law edition of Jakob Böhme. And you see that all the elements of his message are really present in this picture. The first principle of wrath, the second principle of love, together they form the light world of eternal nature. Then, because of the fall of Lucifer, out of these two principles emerges our world of suffering and redemption and reintegration. And it is possible to assume that that Böhme, with this fourth circle here, means to show the final future result of reintegration. So finally, when we overcome the fallen world, then we will achieve a future harmony of unification, the restitution of harmony and light. And of course it also works very beautifully in this picture, because it has of course a cross shape, which of course is very much in line with Jakob Böhme's Christian backgrounds as a Lutheran Christian theosopher. And many things more could be said about this picture, but I won't say them. As you see, there are all kinds of details in it, and you could actually go on talking for hours about this picture. But I think this is sufficient to give you the idea. Böhme's work has been incredibly influential, and the importance of its influence is still underestimated, I would say, still at present. We still do not know enough about Böhme, certainly not in the English-speaking world. His work became the foundation of a Christian theosophical tradition, which goes through several stages. Jakob Böhme's own time, in the 18th century, and especially at the end of the 18th century, in the early 19th century, in the period of Romanticism and German idealism, there's a big revival of Böhmian thought. And one of the important aspects of the influence of Böhme is the impact that it has had on German idealism. So on great, very influential philosophers like Schelling, Hegel and others. The nature of the influence of Böhme on these thinkers is still, I think, not assessed specifically enough, and there's still quite a lot of work and research to be done to really understand how there's a transition from Böhme's ideas to the idealist reinterpretations of Böhme and its later effects in the history of thought for the 19th and the 20th century. We have to be aware, though, that there are great differences between the way that the German idealists have interpreted Böhme and Böhme's own original worldview. I already said Böhme was not an idealist. He was thinking in terms of the body that has to be transformed and not to be overcome and left behind. German idealism very often tends into a direction of minimizing this corporeality and embodiment aspects of Böhme and interprets it in idealist terms. Sometimes this takes shapes which Böhme himself would absolutely have rejected. So we have to be careful not to project modern, post-romantic worldviews back onto Jakob Böhme, and reading our preoccupations back into him. We have to read him in his own context, understand him as a visionary author working with the materials that were available to him in a context very much influenced by alchemy, by Paracelsian thought, and of course by reading the Bible and by actually walking around in nature and reading the book of nature according to his own experiential perspective. Now, this whole tradition of Böhmian theosophy, like I said, extends from the early 17th century far into Romanticism and beyond, and much of this story still has to be discovered. My time for this third webinar is certainly over, so I will not even try to say anything more about all these later developments, but I can tell you we could easily have 10 more webinars about the history of the theosophical tradition. That will have to remain something for the future. Thank you very much.